David, I will introduce you, but I don't think anyone really needs the introduction. David Shukman did a BA in Geography at Hatfield College many, many years ago, and then worked for the local press and then joined the BBC back in 1983. And for those of us who, I won't say that I've grown up with David, but I think a lot of us feel that we've sort of grown through life alongside your journalism, and your face has been familiar to us, and the calibre and integrity of your journalism has been obvious to us throughout the 80s, 90s, 2000s, right up to the present day. And I know that that included initially reporting on the troubles in Northern Ireland, the fall of the Berlin Wall, the launch of the Euro, and then from the early 2000s you were Environment and Sciences correspondent for the BBC, and then you became the BBC's first science editor, and we all saw you from 2012 right the way through to 21 reporting on, explaining, articulating, doggedly refusing to accept poor evidence around climate change. And it's been wonderful to watch your journalism, David, over so many years. It makes us very proud as Durham people to know that you've played that extraordinarily important role actually in explaining to the British audience and beyond, and to a global audience for the BBC, just what climate change means, what we need to pay attention to. And a lot of that has been going to the Antarctic and going all over the world, but you've played an enormously important and transformational role, and it's just wonderful to invite you back. David says it's been about 15 years since he was last in Durham, so I think the IHRR was not then in existence when you were last here, and now of course it's one of our really signature and flourishing research activities, and it's developing a global reputation for the work that it does. So thank you so much for coming. You're going to give us a lecture with the title Reporting from the Climate Frontier, and we're really looking forward to hearing what you have to say.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you. Great to be here. God, if someone had said to me as a young student when I was at Hatfield from 1977, the Dark Ages, to 1980, doing my geography, that I'd be actually giving a talk at Durham with very distinguished professors and so forth in the audience, I would have said you're completely crazy. And also when you hear a sort of wonderful biography like that, and thank you so much for it, it does sound like it's planned. But I mean, the really important thing to be honest about is that nothing in my life has been planned. Things have come along. And I kind of found myself, not quite like Forrest Gump, but I sort of did stumble into roles that later proved to be way more interesting than I thought. So what I'm going to do tonight is try to pick up a few of the threads that I heard in the previous session, because a big part of my reporting involved covering disasters, humanitarian crises. And I'd love in the discussion, which I hope there's time for afterwards, to explore the good, the bad and the ugly of humanitarian aid from an immediate point of view. And there are lots of things to be said about that. But as we've heard, a major focus of my time was climate. And I thought as a little kind of taster, should we see if the tech works? There may be dreadful howling and whatever. A little extract from the first minute of my last documentary for the BBC, which was broadcast during COP26 last November. It's like a little trailer of the best of some of the stuff that I've been involved in. It's now beyond doubt that the Arctic is changing dramatically. I've had a unique position for nearly 20 years as a witness for the BBC to the greatest challenge of our time. How we're damaging the planet so profoundly that we're turning the climate against us. It's a job that's taken me to the farthest corners of the world. I felt despair as extreme weather strikes people least able to resist it. I've been attacked for highlighting the risks of global warming. And I've also experienced hope that clever ideas and a rising generation will help us to find a way through. So this is my story, reporting from the Climate Frontlines. one way I think that I found public engage most keenly with the environmental story is this stuff, plastic. I mean, climate change is invisible, greenhouse gases, you can't see them. Air pollution, you can sometimes see, but the particulates are microscopically small. Of all environmental challenges, I find plastic is the one where people go, oh, yeah, there is a problem. This was a canal in Indonesia. We filmed it. This poor guy from the local council, his job is to clear a 100-meter stretch of canal. He does a very good job. We were with him for most of the day. But then he comes back in the morning, and overnight, another tsunami of plastic comes downstream. And it's quite shocking when you just see it. We've all heard the plastic story, but when you see it day after day on this huge scale, it really is quite challenging, particularly when you realize how many emerging economies there are, which are transition quite quickly from biodegradable banana leaves to hand out small parcels of food to plastic. You realize what an enormous challenge is faced. We know where all this stuff goes, down to the coast, carried by rivers, by canals. This is a fishing village near Jakarta. We asked local people, how deep is this layer of plastic? Thinking they'd say, well, so deep. They reckoned it was 1 meter deep in places, just because there's a daily torrents of plastic waste. The thing that I think helps people engage with plastic as an environmental issue is that most of the items are recognizable. They're everyday, they're bottles, they're bags, they're food containers. So when you're talking to people and trying to engage them with the fact that we're not living sustainably, we are creating a crisis of staggering proportions, they get it more easily if they can see the tangible objects involved. Next step, oceans, obviously. I took this picture in Turkey on holiday. Just happened to notice that one beach was very clean, another one was filthy. Of course, most of the plastic bobs below the surface. So when people say, well, the ocean from above looks pretty clean. So when you dive down just below in that first meter or so, you see all this stuff, and it all starts to break down over the years. Most notorious is the effect of plastic waste on marine life. And we went to Midway Atoll, the not very imaginatively named island in the middle of the Pacific. Midway Atoll, it's inhabited by 30 wildlife rangers, some scientists, some support staff, and a very large population of Laysan albatrosses. The chicks are reared on the island. The adults fly around hundreds of miles, foraging for food, picking up what they think is food. It's often plastic items, including this. We found this chick while I was there, plastic hook. The wildlife ranger we were with extracted it. On the end of it was a little net, plastic net about that long. And it's the kind of thing that we worked out you might see in a supermarket on a display rack. You might see nuts and sweets in a little plastic net hooked onto a display board and used once, like so many plastic items, thrown away, either carelessly or into the rubbish system, and somehow from there finding its way into a river, into the ocean, circulating, collected by an adult albatross, fed to a chick. In the bellies of the chicks, there's a growing quantity of plastic, which means that they can't get the correct level of nutrition, and thousands die every year. I mean, it's a really horrible, visible cause of our carelessness with waste, killing off a really beautiful and magnificent species. On the beach on Midway, we were taking part in a bit of a cleanup, just to see how much plastic can you collect in 10 minutes in a prescribed area. And it was a staggering volume of stuff. And one of the things we found was this little toy. Now, there are no kids on Midway, You know, I mean, no adult would have this, right, in their right mind. This little toy came to Midway, either because Midway sits on the edge of the North Pacific Gyre and currents bring the plastic there, or because, most likely, an adult albatross saw this just below the water, picked it up, thinking it could be a squid, fed it to a chick that died, the chick decomposed. This ends up just as part of the indestructible plastic debris on the shoreline. There are lots of scratches. There's a little bit of calcification. And I asked various marine experts, kind of, how long do you think this little toy was in the water for? I mean, if you wanted Toy Story 5, or whatever we're onto now with the Toy Story movies, this would be epic. Did it fall from a child's hand on a cruise ship? Was it thrown away with a Happy Meal, ended up in a storm drain, got into the ocean, circulating around the North Pacific Gyre? How many times before getting picked up? I mean, certainly been in the ocean for a number of years. And for me, I take it round because I think it is for me, a moving and powerful symbol of how so much of our lives has gone wrong because we're not thinking of what the economists call the externalities, what everybody else just talks about, the damage that our lives, our consumerist lives do to the natural world. In case I leave this here by accident, I didn't pop it back in my pocket. I began reporting on plastic thinking the big problem was these bigger objects that are killing the albatrosses, that are snagging turtles, that are doing all the rest. I've now come to think that it's the smallest bits of plastic that really matter. I took part in an investigation with a great team that carried out very detailed research of the plastic contents of bottled water. We knew that microplastics were turning up in tap water, in the snow, in the air, but we wanted to know, what about bottled water? And the answer was there were hundreds of microplastic particles in bottles of water which have on their labels pictures of mountains and forests and the word pure, and healthy. And it was a big, big shock. Since then, studies have found microplastics in the placenta, in the bloodstream. There's a study ongoing now looking at it, whether it's got into the brain. We know that magnetite particles, which are created by, there are natural ones and also artificial ones created by exhaust tubes. We know that magnetite particles have got into the brain. There's the beginnings of research and literature that talks about a connection between the presence of these magnetite particles in the brain and dementia. Down the track, there'll be research that starts to look at whether an accumulation of plastic particles in the brain could have a similar effect. We don't know. The truth is, we have no idea what will happen to us, in a particular, less so my generation, but younger generations who've grown up with plastic all their lives. Plastic wasn't a feature of my life when I was a kid. There wasn't much plastic when I was at Durham in the 70s. If you bought a sandwich, there wasn't bottled water. If you bought a sandwich, it didn't come in a plastic container. People growing up now have plastic in every aspect of their lives, and we don't know the effect. It may be it doesn't cause harm, but we don't actually know the answer. Part 2, climate change. So, and actually there's a link with plastic, isn't there? Because the biggest producers of plastic are the big petrochemical oil and gas companies. And as Paris Agreement pressure suggests that there'll be a reduction in the use of oil and gas over the next 3 decades, if we're going to meet net zero by 2050, those companies are looking for other markets with a massive expansion in plastic production. So the effect of carbon in the air, this is the Arctic. I've been to the Arctic actually 15 times now to report on different aspects of what's happening up there. I heard very early on in my role covering climate change that the Arctic would be the fastest changing region on Earth, fastest warming. They said, oh, it'll be warming, it will warm twice the speed of the global average. Actually, it's 3 or 4 times that. Last September in Greenland, last month, temperatures were 8 degrees above normal for the time of year. There's a lot of stuff happening up there. So I particularly focused on the Greenland ice sheet, because if the whole lot melts, there's so much ice locked up, so much water locked up in the Greenland ice sheet. If it all goes, that raises global sea levels by 6 to 7 meters. That can't possibly happen by next Tuesday or in a century, but in a matter of centuries, you could lose all that ice. Even if you only lose a bit of it, half a meter by the next few decades, by the end of the century, half a meter on top of thermal expansion, melting in Antarctica, glacial melt from glaciers around the world, you start to get pretty big numbers for sea level rise with massive and terrifying implications for the billions living on coastlines, on or near coastlines around the world. And when, I don't know if everyone's had the experience, you know, the classic climate denier kind of meme. You know, I was interested to hear one of the last speakers talking about hostility to humanitarian workers. I rang a bell. I have had a lot of grief, as you can imagine. You know, that I'm a shill for green companies, that I've somehow got some financial benefit from bigging up climate change. That I've only got a BA in geography from Durham. How does that qualify me to talk about climate change? And we've all probably got uncles who said, well, I've seen on Facebook, you know, I've seen on Facebook volcanoes produce more CO2, whatever. So one of my answers is, I went to Greenland in 2004 to a particular corner of the ice sheet where a glacier flows into the sea. This was 2004, fashionable ski jacket, lots of ice. The scientists then I was with were very worried about the rate of melting and the absence of ice. And I thought, well, what's the problem? It's massive. I mean, there were great ice cliffs. It seemed to be the whole landscape was icy. I wanted to see what had happened 15 years later. So went back to exactly the same spot in 2019, as near as I could get, because actually it was quite hard to work out the precise location. It had changed so much. The glacier had retreated by a kilometer. The thickness of the glacier front had halved from 200 meters to 100 meters. A staggering volume of ice had just vanished and melted. And for me, this was, I know it's only a 15-year time series. 30 would be better. I didn't want to stay on the BBC that long to find out what would happen in another 15 years' time, but I think a 15-year time series isn't bad to see on a personal basis a really dramatic change. Now, the implications are sea level. When I started reporting on this, the general consensus was that the global sea level was going up about 3 millimeters a year, 2-3 millimeters a year. That's now running at about 5 millimeters a year. The projections, which in the IPCC reports that I first reported on, they were very, very cautious. The most recent one, by contrast, includes for the first time low likelihood, high impact, outlandish projections for how much the sea level could rise in the coming decades and centuries. Now, if you live in a rich country, which we do, and if you say, we do not want our capital city to flood, you build one of these, Thames Barrier, gleaming steel structure. But they only reckon it's going to be viable till the 2060s. Maybe by 2070, we'll need a new one. And these things take decades to plan and mobilize and raise the money and build. So they're starting to think about Thames Barrier 2 to be ready for the 2060s. Now, that's great if you live in London, as I do, right? Actually, I live on a hill in London, so I'm fine. But if you're up the coast in Norfolk, and we went to interview the chap who owns this house, who was in his kitchen, which is at this end of the house, one dark and stormy night, when the storm gouged out the cliff, the dune underneath him. He's got a mate with a tractor, and they managed to somehow get the remains of the house onto rollers, and they tugged the whole thing inland, which was fine for 3, 4, 5 years until another storm came. No one is going to build a Thames barrier for him. There are some awful decisions to be made about which communities you save and which you don't. And that's in a rich country. Go to emerging economies, the poorest nations, the climate vulnerable countries, and they're never going to get a Thames barrier to billions. Yet we heard in the earlier panel about the critical need on humanitarian grounds, if nothing else, for climate adaptation. Nothing like the finance is flowing from the richest nations to the poorer ones to even scratch the surface of what's needed in terms of adapting to a more hostile climate. I mean, there was a promise at the Copenhagen COP in 2009 to raise $100 billion a year for developing nations by 2020. And that was mainly for mitigation, to help them go green, rather than help them adapt. And even by the time of COP26 last November, they were short of the 100 billion. And in fact, I think we're now running, it might even have slipped in terms of estimates, we're in the high 80s, maybe 90 billion. And the discussions in Glasgow about adaptation said, oh, we must double it. Well, I mean, it's doubling from a relatively low number to a slightly better number, 20 billion to 40 billion. When the estimates are running into the hundreds of billions, the trillions. And this will be a big and ugly theme at the next COP, COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh next year. That COP being on the continent of Africa, is seen as an African COP. And this will be a huge theme. And of course, the connection with disasters and this event, it struck me when I was just listening to the last session, is the less you adapt and the less you help countries prepare now for what we know is coming, the more humanitarian disasters there'll be. And we know we are sleepwalking into some horrible nightmare catastrophes. I had the most painful, illuminating taste of that in Vietnam. We were filming in the Mekong Delta, one of the world's great rice-producing regions, stunningly beautiful, but sinking as the sea is rising. There's a bit of a debate about, is it sinking more than the sea rising? But nevertheless, both are happening, which means there's more flooding, and storms are getting more intense, with more intense rainfall. So put all that together, they're getting flooded more often. And I was filming in a school, and the teacher asked the kids, who were aged about 9 or 10, bright kids, close your eyes for a minute and just think of flooding. What does flooding mean? What images come to your mind? Then open your eyes, grab a crayon, and draw a picture of your view of flooding. And it was horrific. As we went round the class, watching these innocent little kids drawing their view of flooding. This is one of the least horrific pictures. Kids drowning, houses going underwater. Someone here has got a life belt, but others don't. And it occurred to me that if you're of a certain age like I am, I'm not going to be around for the worst of climate change. You know, I might be around for a 1.5 degree world. I might make it to a 2 degree. But the kids, these kids, age 10 or so, are going to be living through the worst of what the climate models have been projecting, which normally run up to 2100. Kids born now will be living to the end of the century. And I really hate the fact that there's a generation growing up thinking this stuff. I mean, I had bad thoughts as a kid, but I never had to deal with this. I mean, what does that mean in social terms, psychological terms? For a generation in a number of countries, this is a snapshot of one. We could have asked the same sort of question in countries hit by droughts or heat waves. I mean, if you asked a class of Indian kids after the horrific heat wave they went through earlier this year, what would they draw? And what does it mean for society to have kids growing up experiencing stuff that my generation just never really? I mean, we had crises and ghastly stuff, but this awful creeping process that's making life harder and harder. We know what's behind it all. I mean, coal made this country rich. It made Durham rich, right? I mean, I'm sure someone's done an exact funding sort of studies of how much Durham particularly benefited from coal. I mean, coal was in massive decline when I was a student here. It was something I studied actually on my degree. But you know, coal is still being burnt in vast quantities. It's the single biggest contributor to greenhouse gases. This power station we filmed at in Serbia was being expanded with Chinese money and Chinese engineering, part of the Belt and Road Initiative, which they're now rowing back on climate grounds. I mean, we know what happens with carbon dioxide. It hangs around in the atmosphere for 100 years. And so we have created a problem, cumulative emissions, that will cause problems for decades to come. This is meant to come on as a little animation. This is from Ed Hawkins of Reading. I don't know if some of you may know him. Most of this is proxies. This is from data from tree rings, coral, lake sediment. Then you get to the instrumental record, and then that's where we are now. We're at sort of 1.1, 1.2 above the average. 1.5 is where we want to go. We don't go beyond. But I mean, the thing is, we now know, after this summer, what 1.1. We're living in a 1.1 world now. I mean, 40 degrees in the UK, staggering heat waves, terrible drought, fires. I mean, God, what's 1.5? 1.5 is described as safely. What's that going to be? What's 2 going to be? We're actually heading, depending on how optimistic you are, for 2+. Let's be honest. Try to lighten the mood a bit. Yeah, I mean, you know, what are the good things that are happening? So one of the things I've observed over the last 20 years is the rise of renewables. I mean, you know, 20 years ago, they were expensive, didn't work very well. It was easy for climate deniers to say, well, what are you going to do about that? This is in China. We filmed a team throwing up wind turbines at the rate of 2 a day. When they'd started 5 years before, it took them 3 days to do 1. I mean, we are witnessing, thank God, an amazing boom in tech and expertise and ability. Up the road at Blythe, 20 years ago, I filmed Britain's first offshore wind farm. A rather forlorn sight. These turbines standing in very shallow water, and all the experts I consulted. You know, if you work for the BBC, you bring up the top experts in the country, they all answer the phone. And I said, what do you think about this offshore wind? And I asked everybody, said, oh, no, it'll never work. You know, and it's too expensive. 10 years after that, 2013, I was climbing a 100-meter wind turbine tower in the Irish Sea, where they were installing 5 megawatt turbines. And I consulted the experts who said, well, all right, okay, it works. But it's still too expensive. Now, look where we are now. 10 gigawatts of offshore wind capacity, and it's cheaper, 9 times cheaper than gas, right? Experts are a bit quiet now, right? It's a phenomenal success story. If you put together the right regulation, the right incentives, and the right engineers, we can get out of this mess. You know, you put the right people together, it can happen. And again, in Blythe, this was a couple of years just before COVID. This is the amazing, if you ever get a chance to go to the Catapult Offshore Wind Research Centre at Blythe, jump on a train, get in a car, head up there, they test the next generation of wind turbines. So this blade, can you see the little guys on this? I mean, they're tiny, little tiny guys on this huge lift. This blade is 120 meters long. It's going to be a blade on a 12 megawatt wind turbine to Dogger Bank. And one rotation of one tip of one blade produces enough power for one British home for 24 hours. Phenomenal. So we can crack this. Another source of optimism I felt was visiting Scunthorpe, which you don't normally associate with delicious food. Some of the best basil I've eaten in my life is grown hydroponically with recycled water, no pesticides, round the clock, because they got solar on the roof and they got storage, incredibly low carbon. And there are clever people with clever ideas. This may not be the answer for everything, but it just shows how inventive people can be. I'll finish with plastic, because I can see that time is ticking. So, again, I don't want to do expert stuff, but I remember being on a panel with some oceanographers, and I was talking about the plastic pollution problem. And they all said, well, you know, you can never, someone in the audience said, oh, can't we clear it up? And there was a lot of, well, rather disdainful, well, you can't clear up the ocean. Can you possibly do that? But you may have heard of a young Dutch guy, Boyan Slat, who just said at the age of 16, I'm not putting up with this. I've snorkeled in the Aegean and it's full of plastic, and I'm not going to put up with this. It was a direct challenge to the adult world. You screwed it up, and I want you to help sort it, and if you don't, I will. And he gave a brilliant TED talk. He started to raise a bit of money. He got more money. He hired some engineers, and he's ended up now with this plastic collection system operating in the Pacific. He's got corporate sponsorship, he's got Dutch government money, and he's collecting hundreds of tons of plastic. It's a system that's designed to minimize the collection, obvious point, of marine life. You lose a bit, no question. It's still, he wants a fleet of these. He reckons he can halve the amount of plastic in the Great Pacific Garbage Patch, which is in the North Pacific Gyre, which is where Midway was, which is where my little plastic toy came from. He reckons he could halve that in a couple of decades with the right number of vessels operating with this system. Now, it may never work. He may not meet that target, but God, isn't it inspiring? Young guy says, let's do this, let's try it. And you still get oceanographers who say, well, it's never going to, come on, let's give it a go. Let's at least minimize the amount of plastic drifting around in the ocean before it becomes a microplastic, and we all know where that could be. Back to Indonesia, near the canal that I began with, and we came across a village where they also, at a local level, got fed up living in plastic waste. And off their own backs, just organized a collection system. Volunteers bring the plastic to a little sorting center. The women here, in shifts, sort the plastic waste into the different polymers, because they know that middlemen, by arrangement, will come along once a month and collect PET or HDPE and use it to make flooring tiles, to make garden furniture, and small amounts of money, mustn't exaggerate, but small amounts of money come into the village. and the village has got an extra classroom. It's got some more teaching materials. It's a fantastic local success story. It's now caught on. Other villages nearby are doing the same. Local council woke up. Thought, oh, we didn't know you were doing this. Let's support you. So now there's more of a structure to it. The national government heard about it. The BBC turned up and reported on it. And a lot of people asked me, well, how does it work? We want to do the same in our community. And I found that was a great source of hope and optimism. And actually, when people want to get engaged, they can, with a little bit of help perhaps, they can work it out for themselves. Final thought. At a rubbish dump in Indonesia, and there aren't enough rubbish dumps, but at the few rubbish dumps that there are, one of the most valuable items is plastic. This little girl's father is one of the waste pickers who hangs around on the rubbish. Bear in mind, I can't convey the stench to you in 35 degrees of heat, but it smells. And they wait for the trucks to unload the rubbish, and then they fight the guys over the plastic bottles, because the PET that the bottles are made of is the most valuable source of income for them. And I like the idea that with the right interventions, the right ideas, energy, support, finance, this little girl won't have to raise her kids on a rubbish bin. And I think if we can crack that, it'll be a big, big step to cracking the plastic problem. It may also be a big step to cracking the fossil fuel problem. And it won't hurt with the climate problem. And like with the plastic toy, I kind of remember her. Can we get things right for a little girl living on a rubbish dump? And hope that we can usher in a healthier, more sustainable future. Thank you. And now comes the good bit for me, because I'm just dying to hear questions or throw things at me. Oh, it'd be great if there was a climate denier here. That would be even better.
Thank you very much. Fantastic discussion and talk. I was just wondering, the other day we had an event, IHRR CEEE event over in the business school, and we're talking with fairly famous climate economist from the US. He said, well, maybe at some point we maybe need to accept that it's just too difficult to get to like 1.5 degrees, for example. So maybe we should be a bit more, temperate in it. And I had a kind of very strong response about thinking about, not actually thinking about people rather than these sorts of things. Do you have would you have a better, more eloquent way of replying to somebody like that?
It's not that eloquent. Let's have a go. I mean, look, the first thing I would say is at some point, we came out of COP26 with everybody saying 1.9, many saying 1.5 is still achievable. In my view, nothing is happening to make it achievable by 2030. It's just not, we've got to halve emissions by 2030 to make 1.5 even 60% achievable. And I'm afraid in the next few years, our wonderful leaders at some point have to stand up and say, we're not going to make 1.5. Unless something fantastic happens in the next 2 or 3 years, who knows? Okay, silver lining time, glass half full, Putin's invasion of Ukraine, energy price hike, gas is now very undesirable, massive surge of interest in renewables and energy efficiency. It takes catalysts to bring about dramatic change. And maybe this is one, who knows? But if I had to put money on it, we won't be halving emissions by 2030, 7.5 years away. And therefore, I think 1.5 is slipping away. So then it becomes a question of how do you message that? Do you say, well, we've completely given up, and we're going to hold the line at 2, at which point Tuvalu and the people who I filmed with, there, lose their country. Big chunks of Bangladesh go under. Actually, big chunks of Miami go. Mekong Delta, forget it. Do you say that? Do you say, okay, right, even two is a bit tricky, but we're going to hold them at some other level? I mean, frankly, I think at the moment we have to say we've got to do everything we possibly can to keep it to 1.5 or as close as possible to it. And the science is staggeringly clear now. That's another part of my own journey. I've watched the science go from it's likely that human anthropogenic greenhouse gases are driving up temperatures to very likely to virtually whatever. Now it's unequivocal. So, you know, we know what's going on and we know what's likely to happen in a way that we didn't 20 years ago. But I think if we give up now, we are just condemning tens of millions, hundreds of millions of people to a really grim outcome. I mean, you'll have seen the IPCC report on 1.5, which I think was a big shock to the system. That getting above 1.5 to 2, you lose the coral. You know, you just lose a whole lot of stuff and people, and the world becomes less habitable. The number of days when the wet bulb temperature goes above 35, and outdoor work becomes virtually impossible. Shoots up. So I think we have to, sorry, long answer, got to keep trying, because there are real human consequences for which science is very robust.
Thank you very much. You talked about at the start about how plastic often resonates with audiences, and you also sort of gave some, you know, very sort of bleak examples, but some optimistic examples as well. I'd be interested to know how you balance kind of hopefulness and kind of fear and realism in your journalism, and what you think people listen more to.
It's really difficult, because if you bang on and on and on about this is melting and look at the Amazon, I haven't even touched on the Amazon rainforest, that's a nightmare. But I mean, you could, in fact, I did a round of all the worst crises, and editors said, oh God, how much of this are we meant to take? One famous BBC presenter said, God, you've got a weird job. You go to the most beautiful, amazing parts of the world and tell us they're buggered. And I mean, he was only partly in jest. No, then there was a kind of movement for what was called solutions journalism. That people turn off the doom and they want to know what they can do and what others can do. And in fact, all the way through, we've always tried to big up solutions, and we made a more concerted effort to do that. So hence all the reporting on wind and solar and energy storage and all of that. Not easy, by the way, getting a story about loft insulation on the 6 o'clock. You know, I mean, editors just don't really get it. So I think it was a balance that was a work in progress all the time. I mean, I sometimes pushed back about being too rosy about everything, because, I mean, we are trashing the planet. And worse than that, we're hacking away at the few natural systems that are on our side, like the Amazon rainforest. And I think you need to keep up a rhythm of reporting about that, even if it's kind of the same story year after year, because if you let it drop, you're soft soaking what's happening. And that's very dangerous and damaging. So I think you need to kind of, you know, keep that going and just say, sorry, folks, but we all have a hand in this and you need to know about it. And then wherever possible, while being realistic, because the thing that I really found tricky was when some editor would say, oh God, have you seen this? You know, there's a new thing. It's going to, it's hydrogen, it's going to be wonderful. Then you kind of think, well, actually, yeah, okay, it may have an application here, but it won't in these 8 ways. Or it's really good for this, but it's really bad for that. And so I think solutions journalism, we have to be very, very careful not to be too gung-ho about, oh, silver bullets, marvellous, climate solved.
So you showed us the spectacular difference in the Greenland ice sheet when you went out there and you were at the edge of the glacier. Thinking more about solutions journalism, have you ever been back to a place that you'd visited a decade or two before and seen incredible positive change because of implementation of some kind of adaptation or mitigation, something like that?
Yes, I have. So there was an extremely brief shot in the opening video of, in Bangladesh, a whole lot of guys handing lumps of mud onto another. They were repairing a sea wall made of mud that had been damaged in a cyclone. And in fact, our story was all they had was mud. No one was giving them concrete or steel. And that was 2006 and 2008. Anyway, in that decade. And I wanted to go back 10 years later or so. And COVID got in the way of a planned return trip, roughly a decade later. And so I hired a freelance camerawoman living and working in Bangladesh, and she went back for me just ahead of Glasgow, COP26. So she was my eyes and ears on the ground in the same village, see what had happened since I'd been there. So it's not exactly equivalent, but nearly. And she filmed all the stuff I'd asked her to do, including what's happening to the seaweed. So in the time I'd been there, they'd been given some sandbags. 1 or 2 of the seawalls had been strengthened with concrete. Other bits of the seawalls had been trashed again in a cyclone. And to my horror, one of the scenes she filmed on was, guess what? Gang of blokes in a human chain, handing lumps of mud to one another to try to fix a broken sea defense with mud. And that was heartbreaking. There were some good things. When I went, there were literally no storm shelters. 10, 12, whatever years later, some international money had come in to build a school out of concrete, a nice 2-story concrete robust structure, which could double as a storm shelter, which meant that immediately you saved lives. So that was terrific. But one of the things that have got worse was as the sea level rises, there's more saline intrusion into the field, harder and harder to grow rice. Now, there's some very clever Bangladeshi scientists coming up with rice-tolerant variety, drought, saline-tolerant rice varieties, which are great, but they're quite expensive. The structures aren't always in place to get those varieties to the right people. So a lot of people have flipped to shrimp farming instead, which brings another whole package of problems of pollution and whatever. A number of people who need to work. Running a shrimp farm is smaller than the number you need on a rice paddy, it's unemployment. And then really the worst is the supply of fresh water. Absolutely horrific. Harder and harder to find fresh water. And the implications for women in particular are absolutely catastrophic. Because of a whole host of health issues to do with drinking saline water. And the sheer challenge, because the women do all the work, it's the women's job to go and get fresh water. And in the particular village that I went to and that my freelance cameraman went back to, the nearest genuinely fresh water supply was an hour's walk. And the women have to go with a container and lug it back. Some of them have little trolleys or a wheelbarrow or some kind of bike, but basically it's lugging whatever water you need to your family for a day through the staggering heat. And There are all kinds of awful issues associated with that. The women feel vulnerable on these long journeys. If there's flooding, they have to get across the flood to get to the fresh water. Do they pay for a ferry? Do they try and swim? There are snakes in the water. I mean, there are horror stories. And the conclusion is that in that one example that I know from my reading and talking to Bangladeshi experts, that goes wider. It's just becoming harder and harder to live in the desert. And there's more and more drift to the cities. And then you turn up in Dhaka and live under a tarpaulin in a slum, and actually you have a different set of problems. And then you think, can I possibly go abroad? Which gets us right back to the previous section of migration. So mixed bag.
Thanks, David. You've had an amazing kind of breadth of seeing different scientists working in climate science. And I was just wondering, are there opportunities that we're missing? So are there things that you see that aren't being done that you think should be? And this is where we would put in a proposal, obviously, for thinking about, but.
I'll need some time to give you a considered answer to that. But off the top of my head, I find it really, really interesting. For example, the slide I showed of the kids' picture from Vietnam of the nightmare of flooding. That actually is funded. That project was led by a researcher from the University of Hull. Hull is climate vulnerable because of the flooding risk. And I think there's something very interesting there about, if you like, twinning. Researchers from the climate vulnerable community go and study what's going on in a community that's threatened in the same way, but to a different degree. And what are kids in Hull learning from kids in Vietnam, and how does that work both ways? I really like the harnessing of the physical science, sea level rise, what's going on with the river and so forth, and the social side. I think that's very, very positive. I'm particularly motivated by what's happening in the corporate space. Because when I first started reporting on this, there was really real corporate engagement. I mean, other than to deny, derail, delay, slow everything down through obstructionism and all the rest of it. Now we've got a completely different landscape. And we've got some fantastic corporate minds, brilliant engineers, brilliant strategists, thinking about what can they do for their businesses. And there are shining examples. There are really inventive examples. And then there are really insincere greenwashing examples. And for me, establishing robust means of judging who is engaged with this journey sincerely and who's doing it to burnish their green credentials is, for me, a really important issue. I don't think we're going to crack net zero without wholehearted and sincere engagement by businessmen. I know there are plenty of environmentalists who say, shun the business world, because look where they've got us. Look at Exxon, look at these greenwashers. Okay, fine. But these are the companies that make the products. These are the companies that make the wind turbines and design heat ones and solar panels. So I think a piece that's to me really important, and this may be less relevant directly to this institute, but perhaps broadly to the university, is kind of how do you join that up? The science, who's engaged in delivering net zero? How do they get held to account? What are the rigorous yardsticks that we should use to measure actions opposed to greenwashing? And then a third one, here we are in Durham, and I was here during the calamity of the closure of the coalfields, where there wasn't a just transition. which is the phrase now in relation to climate. There was a very, I mean, the injustice was breathtaking. People were thrown onto the strategy with very little support, or none. And I think that's where the sort of scholarly world, the academic world, can offer a great deal. Whether it's the business schools or the experts in dealing with social upheaval, whether it's folks who were brilliant at understanding from other case studies around the world, other related, relevant examples of massive change that's forced on a community. How does that all get put together so that you not only support people who are most vulnerable in different ways, but actually get ahead of the curve and you know what's coming down the track? That's me thinking aloud. 3 examples that may or may not work, but after a drink or two, I might have some ideas.
I think.
Ask the question on behalf of online.
Yeah.
Microphone, so online again.
Yeah.
It's a bit nicer. So the questions come in from Molly Bears. What do you think about dietary change, such as moving towards a more plant-based diets to target our emissions and climate change?
It's really important. I mean, emissions associated with food and agriculture are enormous. We won't get to net zero unless, among other things, there is a change of diet. And I think the key is education rather than preaching. Because I don't like anyone telling me what to do. Natural nature, I suppose. I wouldn't want to have vegetarianism, veganism imposed on me. But now that I've read the science and I've understood many of the angles, I'm encouraged to be a vegetarian. And I think it's that way around. And I think it has to be addressed, but it has to be addressed in a way that's not alien. We've seen enough backlashes and we don't want any more.
So I'm wondering, the most vulnerable to climate change and the people that are most affected by climate change, how aware are they of climate change?
I'm aware.
Yes.
Oh, it's amazing. In some communities, it's free. I mean, you can go to, I mean, as I did, Bangladeshi village. I mean, they won't quote the IPCC, but they'll understand different aspects of it. They'll understand what isn't relevant to them and what is. No, I mean, some countries, particularly with the highly motivated government on this agenda, like Bangladesh, many of the Pacific Islands, it's amazing how much people understand. And I mean, there may be some misunderstandings and some assumptions and leaping to conclusions about stuff, but no, I think it's amazing. And you see this reflected in the countries that send most journalists to COP meetings. There's a rather arrogant assumption that you know, it's sort of the richest nations who have the biggest number of journalists at COP. And it's incredibly inspiring and refreshing to see big delegations of Brazilian journalists or Indian, South African at these events and following stuff really closely and demanding action. And hang on, why is our item being booted off the agenda? And that's going to happen at COP27. African COP, adaptation is a big theme, loss and damage is a big theme, and you can be absolutely sure that the journalists from developing nations are going to be full of difficult questions, as they should be. So yeah, no, I think climate awareness is, you know, I'm sure not in every African village or whatever, but I mean, it's been really striking to me how relevant aspects of the climate science story have reached the people who need to understand.
I might just have the privilege of the very last question, David, and then I think a drink awaits all of us. But can you? I know we absolutely heard what you said about solutions-based journalism and you know those positive vox pop stories and the kind of things that we often see, and the difficulty of balancing that with the more strategic and long-term and very worrying stories. But can you just reflect just finally on one piece of journalism that you did that you really feel had an impact, whether that was about raising awareness or something where you just, I mean, there would be so many to choose from, but do you have a personal favorite, David, from your long career?
Well, I mean, the one that really stands out is nothing to do with climate change, which is that I was in East Berlin when the wall fell. And I spent the night with an East German family who'd watched the wall being built, trapping them on the eastern side of that city, and then 28 years later watched it being opened, liberating them. But no, in climate terms, it is difficult. The one that, in a sense, had the biggest impact was when I went to Antarctica with the British Antarctic Survey. And anyone who goes to Antarctica has to do crevasse training in case you fall into the crevasse. And so the very first day in Antarctica, they kitted us out and took us out onto the snowfields, and you descend through a crevasse. And it was so outstanding for me as an experience that I said to my camera, never mind the training, let's just film this. Because you go down through a narrow entrance out of the wind and snow into this luminous blue cavern. The light comes through the ice from above and the sides and below. I mean, utterly mind-blowing. And there was a fantastic, dangerous looking kind of equivalent of a stalagmite, but a bloody great icicle, 5 meters long, that came from the ceiling of this crevasse right down. And I suddenly noticed there were bubbles inside, trapped air. Now, I'd been wrestling with how to convey the amazing science done by the teams who drill ice cores right through the Antarctic ice sheet and the Greenland ice sheet and analyze the layers each year's snowmelt with bubbles trapped inside, which gives us the climate record going back 800,000 years. I mean, we are here now with our climate understanding because of incredible teams who did this ice coring in these incredibly inhospitable parts of the world. And it's very difficult to sort of film ice coring, and you can't go down a hole, it's too narrow, whatever. And then here was this piece of ice with bubbles in it. And I did a piece to camera, you know, when you talk to the camera. And I had the British Antarctic Survey people with me, so I said, I'm just checking, I'm not wrong here, am I? I mean, these bubbles, you know, right, no, they're bubbles, they're trapped air, probably not that old, but nevertheless, you can make your point. So we filmed this thing with me raving rather overexcitedly about trapped air in the ice, and actually how it could tell us and illuminate our understanding, because you measure the gas in the bubbles and it tells you the carbon dioxide level. We broadcast this from Antarctica. It was a TV first to do live broadcasting from Antarctica, from that particular base. And it caused a stir. And when I had time to check my inbox, it was rammed with people just blown away by this idea, which had been around for a while. It wasn't new science, but I'd somehow found a way of conveying incredibly important science. And I had invitations to talk to schools, to talk to companies, to talk to all kinds of people, and to do more on this. And it taught me that we all have to find ways of connecting with the public. And that one did.
Well, David, you most certainly connected with us, and thank you for such, you know, for giving a sense of the sheer range of what you can pull together because of the huge geographical and long-term experience that you've had. It's been really wonderful to hear you talk.